Hello, my name is Kjetil, and this is the reflective commentary for my diorama. I'll cover different processes I used, reflect upon the pipeline for altering the final material assets in the scene, and go through the development and iteration process for these. I will also evaluate solutions for some of the materials in my diorama, and cover some interesting roles advanced material creation can fill in game environments. I wanted to create a handful of hero assets that could be used as a part of a specific crafting menu or area in a high-end PC game. For animated materials, my goal was to imitate the frying of bacon with sizzling effects in a frying pan, and make an efficient jet flame for the stove below it. I wanted the stove to look used but not ruined. I looked at different references to establish a balance. The stove would have been brought out into the wild on many different occasions, and experienced some lighter wear on its surface. Besides that, the stove is powered by liquid fuel and is made to burn things, so I decided to add some fuel spillage, grease inside the lid from the fried food, and soot on its arms as well as some extra grunge according to how it would be handled. On the contrary, the frying pan, which belongs in the kitchen, should have less wear but still have details like soot and grease. The fresh bacon would be pulled straight out of its packet and put into the pan, so I wanted this to look clean and fresh. The compass would be of military issue and have little wear. It would be dusty and a little worn from previous use, of course, but not damaged, as a broken compass offers nothing but sentimental value in the field. The map would be used and have wear on its folds. Previous usage and crumpling prevents it from folding perfectly back on its folding lines. I wanted the rock to look like it belonged in an environment like this, and here is my main reference. For the burning stove, I used the Optimus 111 as reference. I made a model in 3ds Max before exporting to ZBrush for some of the high poly parts. Sharp bevels and edges for the high poly was done in Max using subdivision methods. The low poly was done in Max. For the flow adjustment piece under the cap, I used intersecting geometry to replicate the surface, using a decimated version of the high poly as reference. This is not something I usually do, but the intersecting meshes baked out well enough for my needs and saved me a lot of time. For the paint job, I blocked out each material type before compositing these together. I layered the materials in a fashion that allowed me to add wear in a sensible way, making use of masks resembled by different layers to make the texturing job more iterative. This sped up the texturing process and allowed quick iterations until I got happy with its final appearance in the engine. On top of the textures, I made use of a second UV channel in order to add normal map details from a trim sheet I made in Substance Designer. I wanted to spend time experimenting with detail texturing for the metal on this piece. I altered a packed mask texture with different details in each color channel, but ended up disregarding this completely as I struggled to achieve satisfactory visuals. To justify the use of detail texturing, I only did one of the shield arms and reused the texture space for the opposite side. The plan was to do this for a number of different elements on this asset in order to reduce the load of unique textures in the scene. But I decided to make a 2K texture instead, as this allowed me more control of the final look and more time to develop other elements of the scene. I did the whole pan in 3ds Max using subdivision methods for high poly. I applied the same techniques when creating the textures for this as for the burning stove. For the sizzling fat details, I should have created a decal to go on top of the pan, which would have allowed me to reuse the decal to add the frying effect to any surface instead of only to the pan. But this could easily be fixed, as I made use of tiling materials to mask out the areas where the sizzling fat effect would take place. I tried to make use of contact areas between meshes, blur this and clamp it down, but having trouble with this I ended up painting out an approximate mask in Painter instead. Some of the grease effects were made using procedural noise from the engine, which I rotated, panned and multiplied together to give an illusion of irregular sizzling effects. I considered creating a flipbook texture for this, but doing so would be a waste, because the details would barely be visible. For future projects, I will lean more towards the use of different tiling, low resolution masks, to achieve more control of effects like this at a lower cost, just by distorting UVs to achieve a cost-effective illusion of motion. I was unsure how to do the bacon at first. After some much needed feedback, I started sculpting the fat and the meat separately in ZBrush, with individual vertex colors to allow for masking of different characteristics in Painter. For the details of the bacon, I created a tileable organic fiber mask in Substance Designer, which I distorted in different ways to author my masks blending the two characteristics in Painter. I made a compass in 3ds Max. I created a transparent plastic material with some basic refraction which I applied to the bottom part in Unreal Engine. To tweak the mirror roughness, I used the metalness channel as I set this surface, excluding its dirt, to be fully metallic in Painter. I created a decal atlas in Substance Designer to add additional details, making use of floating geo. This allowed me to quickly implement details which would not look as crispy had I painted them out by hand. The mesh for the map was done in Marvelous Designer. I tweaked its look carefully to my needs, using a relatively low particle density until I masked off the bottom section and made it fold in on itself a couple of times. I simulated this to drop on top of a section of my low poly rock surface to add variety to the bottom of the mesh, making it look less like a draped cloth. I could probably have reduced the thickness of the cloth material a little bit and added some inset lines to direct stricter folding next time. It would also have been great to add morph targets for when it's laid out flat for usage in game, but for that I should probably have imported a tessellated plane to play around with from another modeling package. The textures for the map were done in Substance Designer, where I used a part of the west coast of Norway for reference when I created the height map. I used histogram select to get the ranges of the different colors and a quantized grayscale for getting the elevation indications. The way I created this allows me to recreate the topography the map describes using my height map in ZBrush if I want to do so in a future project. In the material in Unreal Engine, I made a parameter to tweak the normals, and by chance I realized the normals looked way more believable when I flipped the fold direction to point towards the front of the map. I authored 3 procedural masks, which I packed into a single texture to create a flame. An in-engine gradient was clamped to different ranges to help adjust where the different colors would appear. Some of the masks were also used to distort the UVs of this texture using different panners and blend nodes. For the spitting fat, I made a 64x64 paraboloid to alter refraction, color and opacity for a GPU particle emitter I placed on top of the frying pan. The rock was created in ZBrush. I started off with importing a human scale for reference, then created 3 cubes which I scaled to the approximate shape I wanted my final rock to have before I dynameshed it, and used a lot of trim dynamic and trim smooth border to block out the general characteristics of the silhouette. I continued to finalize the silhouette until I was happy, zero meshed it to get even topology, and worked my way up the subdivisions, adding more and more detail. At the higher subdivisions, I made use of some alphas I bought from CG Textures, before I continued chipping off with different brushes. The final mesh was decimated and unwrapped in ZBrush before I threw it into Substance Painter. In Unreal Engine, I combined the baked normals with the tiling detail normal I did in Designer. I also added parameters to tweak the tiling and power of this effect. When creating materials for games, it's wise to compress functionality into a reasonable number of modern materials, according to what characteristics is required. Modern materials allow for the creation of material instances, where parameters can be adjusted, including texture inputs, allowing for the creation of cost-effective instanced variations. Functionality can be developed separately using textures and code as standalone modular functions, and later implemented into the modern material, where this can be tweaked and toggled as required across material instances, and even masked out with custom input masks unique to each asset, vertex paint, surface normals, or other methods. Material creation techniques like these is used to achieve astonishing graphics, like snow effects on meshes according to wind direction in the scene, how a surface should respond to flames or bullets, and simpler things like what wallpaper should go on a wall. In terms of development, the way a material is created will ultimately affect frame rate and immersiveness for the player, as well as affect the creative freedom for the art team. In my scene, I have a very limited number of assets. The scene is small, and some of its contents here would have different modern materials in a larger game if these were not hero assets. My main focus was not on the optimization of my materials, but rather aimed to have the functionality I needed for this crafting menu. If this was to be a part of an open world environment, and not as a standalone crafting menu, I would have created cheaper materials and assigned those as a replacement on a different mesh LOD once the player would be at a further distance. And on that final note, that concludes my presentation.